everyone. My name is Eric Marks. I'm on the MPSE Board of Directors. Firstly, a few MPSE announcements. The spring edition of our magazine, MPSE Wavelength, is in members' mailboxes and is online. There's lots of great content in this issue, so I'd highly recommend checking it out at mpse.org. At our MPSE store, you'll find lots of fun stuff to get you fully equipped for the summer in our Summer Waves collection. That's mpse.org/store to find what clothes and items that best suit your style. And on our MPSE YouTube channel, you'll find lots of great sound advice events. Head there to see sound breakdowns with the teams who worked on Mr. Robot, Better Call Saul, Metal Gear Solid, and much more. Over the past 15 to 20 years, one key ingredient that has helped bring games to life is hearing the voices of each character that we see on screen. These voice actors are recorded and their lines of dialogue are ultimately implemented into the game. But in between these two steps is extensive work done by dialogue editors to ensure that the dialogue is cleaned up and prepared well to work within the context of the game. Tonight, we'll dig into what that process entails. We're very lucky to be joined by 5 experienced, high-level people who work in game dialogue. We're joined tonight by dialogue editor and voice designer Miguel Araujo, manager of assets and editorial at Formosa Interactive, Duncan Brown, dialogue editor Andre Fonarev, senior dialogue editor at Formosa Interactive, Cesar Marenco, and supervising dialogue editor at Pacific Coast Audio Post, Garrett Montgomery. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So first, I'd love to hear about how and when each of you got your start in video game dialogue editorial. Garrett, why don't you kick us off with when you got started and how your career in this particular part of the industry began?
Well, I originally wanted to get into film and TV and ended up at the old Sound Deluxe building. I ended up meeting a good person who I still am in contact with today, Chip Beeman, and he put me in contact. You know, he was running the Sound Deluxe DMG. I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of start, you know, working there to work on my craft and stuff, and maybe I would, you know, branch out to film and TV. Didn't quite happen. And I stayed in games, and that is fantastic. But, you know, every now and then I dabble in film and TV.
How about you, Paul? When did you get your start? How did you begin in this part of the industry?
I started probably around 2009 or so, 2008, 2009, after graduating from USC. A colleague of ours named Elizabeth Johnson was working at Technicolor Interactive, and they needed editors, you know, for the games department at Technicolor Interactive. So I started freelancing for them, and it was really, you know, a different process from the film and television background that I had, and something, you know, that I enjoyed. You know, it was challenging in a different way, and so I kind of kept on working freelancing for them, and then some of their people ended up going over to Sound Deluxe when they were migrating there. So I kind of followed the work there, and then through to Formosa and Pacific Coast Audio, where I'm still freelancing kind of as a freelance editor for a couple of different places.
Amazing. Cesar, how about you? When did you get your start? How did you begin in this part of the industry?
Sure. I came out to LA looking for an internship, and I came across a company called Blind Light. And I had done some research previously, and I noticed that they had posted on their website that they did sound design and a couple other different things. And as soon as I got there, it was just like a 4-person gig, and all they did was pretty much casting. So, but they were nice enough to help me out, and they they got me in touch with their freelance person, David Atherton, who took me under his wing, and he got me on the track of dialogue editorial. So yeah, it's been great.
Amazing. How about you, Miguel?
Yeah, I originally came to Canada and went to Vancouver Film School that had a really extensive film department, well, post-production side to it, as well as game audio. So I had a lot of friends that got into the game audio side of things and still are currently there. But I was kind of pushed into freelancing and film and TV, and I've done most of my stuff supervising and mixing it in post-production, TV and film stuff. That said, about 3 years ago, one of my buddies at Clay Entertainment hit me up and said, "Hey, we've got a really extensive cinematic, or a bunch of cinematics we need for one of our games." So I kind of dove in with them, just doing the cinematics, supervising, mixing them with a team of people. And then about 2 years ago, a friend of mine at A Shell in the Pit Audio hit me up for jumping on Godfall and doing all the voice design for that, which has been a blast, and we'll see where we go from here.
Amazing. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that. Duncan, how about you? How did you get your start in this part of the field?
Well, I was actually working as a PA at the on the lot in Hollywood when Formosa Group formed, and then I also had the good fortune of meeting Chip Beeman, who Garrett mentioned earlier, and he basically needed an assistant to come join Interactive, and so I was like, that seems like it'd be fun. Let's try it out. And then worked there for a little while, and then basically there was a need for editorial help, so I joined, started doing that, and been doing it since.
Amazing.
Yeah, there was a good chunk there where Duncan and I worked together, which was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
we've done a lot of work together.
That's amazing. And Chip was at our last event for Metal Gear Solid too. So some people got to get to meet him and learn a little bit about him as well. Many people in the film and TV sound communities have never touched game audio, let alone game dialogue. So just a question for the group. Whoever wants to answer this first, feel free to jump in. What makes editing dialogue for games unique compared to dialogue editing for film or TV?
I can jump in with that. I will say the sheer amount of assets that you deal with, that's something I had no idea about. In film and TV, we just have dialogue lines that go across an entire scene, and sometimes, depending on the quality of the audio, you might not necessarily have to get super micro with it, and certain lines kind of just play as long as you've got good microphones. Whereas at least in games, every single line needs to be addressed and adjusted and created as an asset, which was a huge jump for me, especially when you're dealing with 20,000 plus assets for a single character.
Exactly. Like they don't need to be, blended into fill as in TV and film. We're dealing with each asset individually.
Yeah, I was kind of pondering that. Like, I was thinking as an analogy, sort of like if you're building a soundtrack in film and television, and you're imagining that each shot or audio piece is like a jigsaw puzzle piece, and you're putting it all together and trying to basically make it seamless so that all those seams between the puzzle pieces disappear and you're seeing the picture on the whole. In game audio, what you're doing instead is really refining and crafting those individual puzzle pieces, because ultimately a computer program, the game is going to be the one putting everything together and assembling it, sort of like a giant automated, assembly line. And so if those pieces aren't properly labeled and crafted so all those edges line up perfectly, the computer program knows where everything is and what everything is called, it's not going to work properly, because it's ultimately not a human being that's essentially mixing, the game. It's a designed computer program that's automated.
Yeah, I think along with the sheer volume of assets, like you mentioned, which is definitely the main thing, it's frankly overwhelming when you first get into it, realizing how much there is, especially if you're working on multiple projects at the same time. But I think also not always having great context on exactly what's going on with the assets that you have. I mean, you can discern it from the script. You can use common sense, but you still don't always know exactly what's going on. And so sometimes you aren't given enough context to really know what to do. And you just kind of have to use your best judgment and hope for the best.
Yeah, the most context you have is definitely going to save the developer money. Like if they're recording a whole bunch of lines that ultimately going to get futzed through a radio, Call of Duty style.
Yep.
Like, why are we spending time going in surgically taking out every clicks and pops and stuff? Those clicks and pops are actually going to sound good when you put them through speakerphone.
Yeah.
So if anything, we're actually damaging it. So it's really good to have context of lines before we even start working.
Yeah, there's only one project that I can think of that we worked on where we were given that context beforehand of like, you can deal with certain characters this way, but all these characters, they're all going to get futzed. It's all going to be processed. Like, don't worry about it. Just top tail name, get rid of the most egregious stuff. And like, I remember getting that and being like, why can't we get this context on everything we do? It's so nice to know this. It would be so great if that were more possible, but for some reason it's not.
Yeah, a lot of our job, we kind of feel like we're flying blind, like we just want to make the asset sound as good as possible to give the developer, the implementer, just good puzzle pieces, right? To make the game with. We don't know how they're going to play if we're not giving context. So we just got to make them sound great.
Yep. Yeah. Pristine.
Yeah, and at the right volume, which is a whole other thing. It's just like whispers need to be at this volume, shouting needs to be at this volume, and respectively, conversational, normal speaking at this volume.
Yeah, I feel like mastering was the thing that took me the longest to really get a hold on when I first started, especially, when you're dealing with real small individual assets versus like, longer, more monologue-y stuff. Like you need to get really granular with that stuff to make sure that it's going to sit right, sound right, be consistent. I mean, there's so much that can go into those. That definitely took me the longest when I first started, but and I feel like.
Well, what we're failing to mention is that like we're only editing or mastering one side of the conversation for the most part.
Yeah.
The other side of the conversation might come in a recording session next week or next month or next year.
Next year, yeah. Yeah. It's really it's incredible that it all does end up sounding as consistent as it does in the game when you consider how far apart all of that stuff can actually happen,
Well, yeah, that's interesting too, that like Garrett, what you mentioned about removing clicks and pops, if you have context that it might not even be worth the time or energy or resources to do something like that. Could you guys maybe talk to, I guess, the overlap between responsibilities of dialogue editing for games compared to film and TV traditional dialogue editing? Like maybe the overlap of responsibilities between those two, and also like the separate responsibilities that might not be within game dialogue editing that film and TV dialogue editors might expect.
I mean, I think a major one that Garrett already mentioned is leveling the dialogue. Like in a show, we might, in film and TV, we'll want to get it sort of in the pocket, but we're not going in line by line or moving up, syllables and stuff like that. We leave that to the mix. But yeah, same thing. And all the dialogue stuff that I've edited, it's a very specific number they want to hit because it's going to go right into the game and they don't want to touch it at all. So that's definitely a big jump between the two.
Anyone else want to add to that, of responsibilities like that you think are in common or separated?
Well, I think ultimately, the goal is the same between game and film, TV dialogue editing in order to make things sound, appropriate, to and natural. But again, like Garrett was saying, because you don't often have the context of what a line's purpose is, or where it's playing, I think I always approach game audio with the expectation that everything has to be extremely clean, because you don't know if a line is necessarily going to be playing in like the middle of a giant battle and there's a lot of other things happening, or if it's in a quiet moment and there's nothing, to hide behind in terms of like noise and, clicks and stuff like that. So I always tend to, because of that, I think you always have to tend to approach things and be a little more aggressive with cleaning things up, unless, there's that context is given. So, I often, even before I'm mastering and monitoring with like a limiter, punching everything up in place, just so I get a sense of what things could sound like, kind of thinking about the next step, and also being able to catch all those little details, like even just the most minuscule clicks and pops that you might not hear unless you're monitoring, at that kind of level. Because, sometimes I might not be doing the mastering phase, and I have to assume that, the loudness that they're going for might be really high, and that I don't want, any of my work to negatively impact the next step.
And you also want to help them out on the next step too.
Yeah.
Like you might not want to pass off a very dynamic line that's just hitting spec. You might want to do some clip gain throughout that line just to pass on to the guys that are mastering it. If they start off yelling and then at the very end they're whispering, to pass that off and say, make this -15. You're not going to hear that back half of the line. So
yeah, especially on longer phrases. I'll be chopping things up, sentence to sentence or sentence to sentence, or even, word to word or less, just to get everything to feel like it's flowing naturally. Because, again, there's not a re-recording mixer like in film, TV, who's going to be able to push that fader up or down. The game engine is not going to know, oh, this needs to be louder, so those decisions in some ways have to be baked into the files ahead of time.
I feel like what you're speaking to also is one of the hardest things to sort of get across with people that you're working with that are doing this for the first time too, is like you can sort of give them a mastering spec, and maybe the stuff will hit the right lux targets, but if certain lines can sit way too low, and you'll be listening to it and be like, this is just going to get buried in the game if you don't go in there and level this out properly, and I think that speaks to exactly what I was saying before about, that was certainly my own learning curve with it as well when I first started, was just knowing how that stuff is going to sound and balancing it appropriately.
Well, it's like understanding different speech projections, which took me years to finally grasp it, but we hear it in day to day all the time, so there's spoken, there's projected, and then, in the middle, there's kind of like the spojected,
Love that word.
Yeah,
soft,
and
whisper,
you kind of hear it all. Like, it's either you're talking to somebody right beside you, you're talking to somebody 2 feet away, or you're talking to somebody across the street. There's a difference of how you project your voice, and that projection needs a different kind of mastering treatment, to sit well in the game.
Yeah, I remember it was actually explained by Dan Francis, who I know is on this call. I remember working with him. Hey, Dan.
Yeah, he's creeping here somewhere. Hey, Dan.
Yeah, hey, Dan. He was definitely, I remember when I was, first I was really getting my understanding of it. And I remember we sat and he explained it like that to me. And as soon as you think of it like that, it's so logical that it feels insane that you didn't get there. But it's easy to sort of overthink these things or not really understand at first, but you really just think of the way that it would sound if you yourself were talking, projecting, yelling. I'm not going to do it on this call for the sake of everyone, but we know what yelling is. It's you just pay attention to the way it's being performed. It's all about the performance,
Absolutely.
Yeah, depending on decent recordings.
Yes.
Once you start getting like people that are off mic and weird things, then all of a sudden you have to hit different numbers to get to the same perceived loudness.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Very interesting. In game audio, I think one thing that really kind of confuses people who aren't in game audio is the separation of like the core internal game audio team, like within the development team working at the company, and then external people kind of supporting them, external vendors, freelancers, people kind of supporting that vision from the outside, and what roles or in those, in those positions. So on a game audio team, there's typically like an audio director and a core sound team, working directly on that game team. But then dialogue editorial work is often outsourced to external sound editors. For all of you, how closely do you work with the game team when you're editing game dialogue?
It varies wildly, I would say. There's certain developers we work with where we're in lockstep with them the entire way. There's open lines of communication the whole way, and in a lot of cases that might be because their process is a little different than the way that you would normally approach things, so you kind of need to be. I would say more often than not, you're not really afforded much beyond maybe an initial kickoff conversation. And then you're just given the specs and just like, all right, go for it. And then maybe get some notes, and that's it. I mean, I would love to be able to have more communication, more context, like we were talking about earlier. It just doesn't seem to happen as much as we'd like for one reason or another.
I mean, what we're dealing with, it's too, once you lock in those specs are concrete. They need to stay solid for however many years the game is in production. So yeah, I mean, sometimes we'll have a line of contact with an audio director or something, usually an audio director. Most of the time it's just to ask when we get a recording session that might be a robot character, and I'm like, oh my gosh, robots don't breathe. Do I need to remove all these breaths? And then if I remove the breaths, do I need to shorten the gaps? So it's great to reach out to somebody that can, answer that question quickly. So then they get their files quickly and implement it in the game without breaths. Some robots breathe though, as I've learned.
Yeah, I was gonna say from my side, it's definitely depended on the project. Like on Jet the Far Shore, they created an entire language where they actually had like a full dictionary of this like gibberish language. So in the record sessions, we recorded for weeks all these people doing these broken sentences that eventually through a dialogue tree would be put together and make sense. But in the edit phase, like I went through probably a day before I went, wait guys, I need some context of like what is even happening. Like should I shorten this gap, or does this weird sound part of the word, like there was a lot of back and forth. We had to figure out like, hey, what should stay in the dialogue, because I don't actually know. So.
That's really interesting. Duncan, you mentioned like an initial sort of kickoff call with a team when you're starting. When you're coming aboard a project, what are these early conversations typically like with the audio team on the dev side?
It varies a lot. Mostly it'll just be assuming that call even happens, which again, that still feels more rare than I'd like it to be, but it'll normally be, maybe just asking some of the questions that we're talking about here. If there's a chance to ask about it, like, are you going to have any robot characters? Is there anything that you need treated differently than just the standard editorial and mastering pass? Like, is there anything that's going to be futzed that maybe we don't need to get as granular with? Again, I think we probably all wish that we could have more conversations like this, but it doesn't happen. But that's normally what it would be, just trying to get as much context as possible to make sure that you're approaching everything the right way,
I think there are also different conversations that might happen between editors and also people that are handling the billing.
Yes.
One question might be like, will there be a lot of ADR? Obviously ADR is going to take a lot of time, and we treat ADR in games the same as film and TV. We do it to beeps, we cut that, that asset, and then we make it good. So that's going to take more. It's going to cost more. Yep. That's a good initial conversation to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another place those conversations are really important is on Godfall. Actually, we did all the 5.0 reverbs on the cinematic voices that were triggered by the game engine, so we had to bake that into the files, and it was definitely something we had to figure out hey, I have no context of what the game, this part of the game sounds like. How much reverb do we want? What does the space sound like? So that definitely opens up a room for some conversation to get to the right place.
How often or frequently are you dealing with changes of direction after you've already started on a project, you know, or just changes in expectations on what you're delivering?
I in terms of expectations of like the editorial details or mastering spec, I wouldn't say that changes all that often. That feels rare. I would say that the thing that changes is how much sooner they want stuff and how much more of it they want sooner than maybe they did originally. And how they would like no dip in quality whatsoever, despite the fact that they need it faster and they need more of it. I would say that's definitely one thing.
Yeah, sometimes you like to get you get surprised that, oh, we're simultaneously recording at 4 studios now, and we're gonna still deliver you all the assets.
Yes, that quite literally has happened, and
that happens a lot with games, you know, as we're getting the crunch, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like, oh my God, we need to record like almost all of the VO, and we need it edited. What are we gonna do? You know, that has definitely happened. Fun stuff.
Wow.
Being a freelance editor that has worked for both Garrett and Duncan, I find sometimes it's a little feast or famine from my end, where like there won't be anything, and then all of a sudden, you know, like you said, multiple talent will have recorded over the course of a week, and all of a sudden there's a ton of material and it has to be done next week, you know, and you know it wasn't scheduled out separately, so it could be processed properly, you know.
Yeah, I'm feverishly emailing you, Paul, where are you, Paul? that is definitely happened a lot.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's all feast or famine in this industry. You know, you get the work when it's good, and there might be a lot of it. You know, you get it.
Yeah.
What's you kind of spoke to this a little bit, Duncan, but just in general for all of you, what's a typical speed that you would expect from game dialogue editors in terms of turning around their edited clean depth dialogue? Like, are there certain benchmarks you're usually expecting, a number of lines per hour, per day, or things like that?
We normally expect about 250 lines per 8-hour day, give or take. I mean, there's obvious factors like recording quality and actor clickiness, and there's certain actors that you spend enough time working on, you know, like, all right, this one's probably going to take a little bit longer than it usually would to get it cleaned up. And then when you add in what we were talking about at the very beginning about all the remote recording that's been going on and the varying levels of quality that you'll get from those remote recordings and how much longer that might take to work on. I mean, I definitely have tried to be a lot more flexible and forgiving with people because of those variables recently. It's just not quite what it used to be, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. So you just kind of have to just roll with it.
How about the rest of you all? Have you dealt with different sorts of expectations of number of lines per hour, per day, or like what your clients are kind of pushing you towards?
For myself, it's always kind of generally been the same, you know, and it's depending on context too. You know, 30 lines per hour, which kind of translates to what Duncan said, per day. You know, if we get into like, oh, we're going to give you a whole bunch of radio lines or just a whole bunch of shouting lines, you know, we could maybe expect 40 or 50 or 60 lines an hour for that. ADR, or doing like, you know, I had to do some binaural recording or editing for Halo Infinite with WB, you know, and obviously that's going to take a lot less because we're editing multi-channel dialogue, you know, the binaural, all the mics all at once. So I think we were down to maybe 10, maybe 15. I'm not sure, but it varies on what we do.
Yeah, I think that the context is pretty important. You know, usually when I'm starting a new session, always take a little more time at the top, because if it's especially if it's a voice actor that I haven't, edited before, it takes a little while to figure out what the idiosyncrasies of a character or a voice are. Some people are really clean and, it just goes really fast because there aren't any major issues. And some people have terrible, very, very resonant sibilants that has to be taken out, or just super clicky, or, the P's are popping all over. It's really, it's really performance, and every performer is different, I think. So it's hard to standardize that to some extent. So usually what I tend to do is kind of benchmark as I go along to see like how many minutes of material I've gotten through per hour. And usually it'll be a little slower at the top, and by the end, like, my expectation of, how long my entire process is going to take has shrunken down, because I've gotten kind of a rhythm and a sense of what needs to be done. So I'm, having to think about things or second guess myself a little less, because I've gotten a sense of that voice.
Thinking back to just kind of like earlier in each of your careers in this part of the field, how long did it take each of you to work up to that pace that your clients were expecting?
Luckily, I worked at some forgiving places at the beginning of my career, like the people at Technicolor and Soundalux DMG. They worked with me as I was building my speed, which was great. But I think ultimately it probably took me a couple years to develop the ear, and by ear I mean knowing what to remove and what to keep. At the beginning, you just want to remove everything because you don't know what to do. You just want to make it clean. But that's going to take a lot of time, and you can save a lot of time just going in for the egregious stuff, the stuff that's going to hit, people's ear the wrong way. You just fix that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It took me a couple of years. I think it took all of that, and also the denoising side of things too. That was definitely one that actually might have been one of the more challenging things to master, because it's hard, and you want to get it as clean as possible, but you don't want to strip away any of the voice, and you don't want to get rid of too much, but if you leave too much in there, then it's going to be like, why is this noisy? It's hard. It can be pretty time consuming. So definitely a few years, but I was fortunate in the same way that Garrett was, that I had an opportunity in a situation that allowed me to figure that out and work through my mistakes.
That's great. How about the rest of you all? Yeah, Miguel?
From my side, I mean, I've been working in post for the last 10 years, and I've always worked my way up to getting as fast as I could in that, as well as using macros and any other sort of keyboard shortcut software-driven stuff that I can. But yeah, the first game I jumped on a few years ago, like they wanted like hundreds and thousands of assets within days. And it was quite a shock to me. I think the first one I sent off like 3,000 assets, and they were like, hey, it needs to be tighter to the actual waveform. I had to go back, get it back in, because I thought, this is close enough, and I didn't realize like how fast that has to trigger with the game engine. So I
think we've all redelivered 3,000 assets before in our career.
Yes.
Once or twice.
Yeah.
It definitely took a while, but I think film and TV stuff I did before saved me to get faster quicker, because if I'd done that day one, that would have been terrifying.
Garrett, you touched on this, I think, a little bit right before we started the event, but I'd love to hear from all of you just kind of what COVID has done to this process, how it's affected what you're able to do, and maybe added to or changed the way you all work.
Well, one thing's for sure is we like to record a lot of room tone, before every session now. Something like that we never used to do, because we would record in professional studios. Would it be Formosa or Technicolor or Warner Brothers? They're great booths. They sound great. Home studios, it's hit or miss. So And ultimately, we're all trying to make this stuff sound like it's coming out of the same environment, which adds to the challenge. You know, I'm definitely not complaining, but as a dialogue editor, the past 2 years has been the most difficult in my career of 10 years due to COVID, because the expectations are the same, but we're recording in home studios.
Yep, agreed, 100%. Most of the actual like work itself is not that different than it was before. People, editors have their home setups. Everyone's pretty used to that. We were pretty used to working remotely and interacting via Slack and email the way that we always have. So none of that really changed. It was really just the recording quality, you know, taking a nosedive in certain respects, whereas the expectation stayed exactly the same, like Garrett said. Like that can just be tough. And also, like I was saying at the beginning too, like dealing with thinking that an actor is recording with a, you know, certain type of gear in a certain space, and then finding out that they're not at all, and they're in just some big open wooden room or something like that. That is not going to work for stuff like this at all.
Yeah, and there's just extra steps, because a lot of times, you know, the director and the engineer will be working off of, you know, a Source Connect feed, you know, the remote feed, and the actor will be recording locally, and then those files have to be synced up against the Source Connect and re-pulling all those selects. So there's extra steps involved in the process, and then just making sure that, you know, that the quality is, you know, where it needs to be. I was mentioning at the top that I've run into a couple cases where, you know, the voice artist will have applied noise reduction for some reason to the file, and, you know, it sucks some of the life out of you know, the quality. You have to scramble to say, well, do we have a pre-processed version of this, or, you know, can we make changes? If not, sometimes you just have to roll with it. Yeah,
I think one of the tricky things with the remote stuff too is, as much as we fight for the best sound, we're also kind of stuck when it's with talent for keeping the talent happy, you know? So there's this sort of balance with like, hey, this person's going to record it in their bedroom with their loud PC just going psh the whole time. And you might spend 3-4 days going back and forth doing tests trying to, you know, mitigate that, but it ultimately gets to the point where the talent's starting to get frustrated, and it's like, all right, man, this is the best we can get.
Yeah.
We can with it.
We capture some room tone of that and we work extra hard.
I remember one instance in particular where we were recording an actor remotely, and we were obviously recording Source Connect. We got the file back from the actor after the session had recorded, and it did not sound like Source Connect. So a little back and forth in between the actor and myself, and I come to find out that he had recorded into his SAW using his laptop microphone instead of the microphone plugged into his interface, which he had sent to Source Connect. So things like that, where you're dealing with actors who are learning stuff, you know, through articles or YouTube, and they think they have their setup all figured out, and you have to work around that. So yeah.
There was also that one, remember, Cesar, we got that one, someone I believe had set up right next to their refrigerator. So there was refrigerator hum over the entire thing, and we got it, and we're just like, is this what we think this is? Like, there's no way. And sure enough, that's what it was. That was a fun one.
I think laptop bands
you
are
don't
the
want to
worst.
go down this path. We could just keep telling horror stories.
Yeah.
I mean, for the next hour, really.
Yeah, that could take up the rest of the call easily.
Yeah, really. So.
Well, I mean, I think that's the bottom line, is that in some ways, you know, I think before COVID, the process was a lot more standardized. You know, the engineer had a responsibility, the voice talent had a very specific responsibility, and now that burden has shifted a little bit to the voice talent. And, you know, some of them are more capable than others, and, you know, in some ways, you know, it's difficult to expect them to be perfect, you know, audio engineers. That's not their background.
Yeah,
so you have to find ways of making that work the best, you know, for everybody, you know.
Yeah, and
the past couple of years, I've also been remote engineering, and I've realized that it's, I used to do a lot of engineering for Formosa and WB and stuff like that in person in an actual studio. Remote engineering is completely different. I'm just listening on headphones, listening to the Source Connect feed, trying to hear if they're off mic. It's a completely different skill that I feel like I've been developing over the past couple of years, which is very strange.
Yeah,
But pretty
and
cool.
it's easy to sort of joke about some of the horror stories that we've run into, and it is funny, but like it's not fair to expect that people that have never ever had to think about this in their life suddenly have to be professionals at this. Like it's completely unrealistic to expect that. And so I think that's, we're lucky to have great engineers that we work with that do pay attention and are, to the best of their ability, able to work with actors remotely and make sure that, that they've got their mic placement is good, that their gear setup is correct. And there's definitely, there's been a lot more of that over the past couple of years than there was before. But I think I feel like that open dialogue too has kind of helped make, maybe not in every case, but in a lot of cases, it's kind of helped create a good vibe in the session between the engineer and the actor to be able to have that kind of, Garrett, you could speak to that since you've been actually doing it, but it seems like that's what's been happening in some cases.
Oh, for sure. And this also goes into context too. Like if we know that like all those lines are going to get futzed or processed, then let's not stress about trying to get 150% quality, on a remote recording.
Yeah.
Let's try to get some good assets for the sound designers to work with.
Yep, absolutely.
And what tools are you all using within Pro Tools to ensure that you're delivering the best quality cleaned up dialogue as you can? Like are there specific plugins or pieces within plugins that you're always using as your go-to tools?
Nothing in Pro Tools.
Yeah.
I do very
DAW,
little
yeah.
in Pro Tools as well.
Loads of RX.
It's straight. It's RX connects right away. Do everything there pretty much. Back into Pro Tools, and then if I catch something else, back to RX. It's like,
Yep.
I think that's really been, that bridge has really made things much easier and faster, and it's just easier to work with audio directly using the spectrogram and stuff like that. I can clean out just high frequency pops without touching the plosives or T's or stuff like that, just really get what I want, and you can do some of that in Pro Tools, but it's not the same level of granularity that's required for game audio, I think.
Yeah, RX Connect all the way.
Yeah, I just send 32 files at a time to RX Connect. I work on 32 files because that's the max you can send. I send them back, I render it, I go to the next 32. The only things I really use in Pro Tools, that are very helpful, Sound Radix does auto align post. I use that quite a bit when we use, we record multi-channel mics. Obviously the mics are at different distances, so we want it to all line up, and as we deliver the files, the waveforms all have to be matched in case the developers want to flip through a different mic. Other things that I might use might be I forget the name, Quiet Art, I think is the company. Defaulter.
Yeah,
I use
you
Defaulter quite a bit to just kind of like, basically it works with Keyboard Maestro. It goes through and it just adjusts the clip gain of every single file to what you set in 0.5 dB increments. Saves a lot of time, to get things like in the ballpark before you send it to RX.
That's great. I specifically did want to ask too about just ideal tools that you all use to make this process fast, as fast as possible, given the amount of lines and the turnaround times. Are there lots of tools you all use that help automate your process, or whatever Garrett's showing right there?
Is Stream Deck?
Stream Deck.
Okay.
Yeah, I love my Stream Deck. I use Keyboard Maestro. I made all these little, macros to do everything I want. Like I have basically every button just renders. but I have, ambient match, DS, spectral denoise, deplosive, breath control, gain, dewind. Everything's right on there. When I go to a different application, it switches there. It shows everything there, which I want to do. It saves me tons of time just having it right there.
Another thing I've been diving into, I'm still somewhat new with it, but is SoundFlow. I started checking out SoundFlow recently and have been looking into that for macros, and that company is great, and it seems like it's just getting better by the day.
Yeah, I found Reaper for batch processing stuff was also really essential when I needed to do a FUTS to like 20,000 lines, and I could just throw them all in, figure out a sort of in between where it doesn't get too hot, doesn't do it too lightly, and at least get something that works for all of them.
And how many windows are up on your screens when you're doing various tools at once or in a certain order?
I have 3 screens.
Yeah, two large screens and the iPad as a sidecar third screen.
Well, and especially
like how many
dialogue
plug-in
when we're doing
windows?
the scripts.
Sorry, Miguel, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, with dialogue stuff is which we touched on right at the beginning. It's like another huge difference from film is we have these Excel spreadsheets or Google Docs that have all these file names and everything's exactly got to be the correct way. Even one increment out or one letter and it doesn't fire in the game. So I've got like the script on one side, my keyboard maestro stuff that I'm switching between, RX, Connect, and all of that stuff. So your screens get pretty full pretty quick.
Yeah, and actually, oh, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I don't tend to use Stream Deck. I tend to come up with these ridiculous keyboard, shortcuts within Pro Tools. I have one where I just hit Shift F, which I know now is for folders in Pro Tools, but basically that will perform a 30-step macro where it'll copy a file down, consolidate, rename based on the script, go back to the script, get the next script file, go back to Pro Tools, jump up, go to the next file, pull it down. If I need noise reduction, I'll do that. And it's just been essential. And it's gotten so elaborate that I have a separate menu now where it's are there alt lines in this, and that'll determine how things are laid out. Or, is the file name include .wav at the end, and it'll make adjustments based on that. So it gets very, very complicated. And from project to project, slight variations, like Miguel was saying, they can cause problems. So you have to make sure that everything's consistent, and you have to make sure that your workflow, it can be adapted, to the project so that you can keep that pace up.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, just to mention that really helps me out that I can't live without has been the Kensington Mousework 4-button,
the trackball,
these guys here. And mostly just because I use the chords a lot. So when I'm in RX, I'll use the chords to switch to the next tab. The top chords, I'll use the bottom chords to do little voice denoise in between the gaps. So I'll just highlight all the sections and go tut, 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 tut. It's very helpful. And it probably attributed to my carpal tunnel, but it works.
In dealing with all the assets too, and what you were referencing about, if you have just one that's off and it won't be triggered by the game engine, that's another kind of going back to one of the earlier questions. That's another part of all this too that is really hard. Is once all this stuff is taken care of too, it's all got to be checked. Someone's got to go through and check all this stuff and make sure that it's all correct. The file names are all correct, because you don't want to be sending off stuff that doesn't work. You need to be able to just take this stuff, put it in the game, and move on, because that's exactly what they want to do. So that's just another part of it that can be really time consuming, but is essential. It's just making sure that it's all checked and done right.
I guess following up from that,
real time.
Yeah, another good thing that speeds you up is renaming tools like Better Finder Renamer. There's times where Pro Tools names with this .l, .r, whatever caps, and if we're doing 5.0 stuff, but let's say if it's Unity, it has a very specific lowercase naming. So you can just throw 1,000 files in there, tell it, hey, every time you see this .l, call it this, and it will just switch it all in seconds. So super helpful.
Another one is Delta Walker, which I absolutely love. Like,
Yep.
just say you bring in a whole bunch of thousands of files into process. You want to spit them out to another folder. It basically is a really good thing to compare the two folders. Lets you know if you're missing anything at the end.
Essential.
Yeah, I use ChronoSync for that in the same way, but it's a little clunky for that, but it's it works for me.
Yeah, between
Miguel,
a
I
name
wanted
checker and that, and you know, if you can have content checker, you know, it's sometimes hard to get to have somebody actually listen to everything and look at the words. But yeah, that's ideal. It's a lot of checking after we do our work.
Miguel, I wanted to follow up with you too. So you mentioned that you were the dialogue designer on game projects as well. What does that work entail compared to just general dialogue editing?
I mean, it started out by me thinking Ben Burt can't be the only guy that gets to make a designer title. So, no, I'm joking. It was a fun change from, you know, mastering and editing the individual assets. Garrett and his team on Godfall, where I was doing that mostly, they delivered me everything, and it was perfectly set out and labeled and clean, so I could just take that and then go, okay, look at a visual of the character and go, okay, this guy is made of lava and, you know, spits fire. So, you know, I could use something like Synaptic Morph and add these like liquidy, bubbly things into the dialogue, as well as hard edit bubbly sounds at the beginnings and ends to try and create this characteristic that's unique. You know, but even people like the Sanctum in Godfall, she's in your head essentially talking the whole time. And, you know, we went with the stereo, sort of reverse reverb ethereal feeling, which was really cool. She's one of the main characters, so there's tons of lines for her the whole time. But what's really cool on the latest iteration that we did for the latest DLC is that one of the main villains, Macros, comes back. So huge spoiler I just gave there. But he comes back and he actually takes over the Sanctum, and but we played with that where it was more distorted. He's coming out quad with LFE, so we really made him feel overwhelming, like he was taking over everything and pushing the player to feel claustrophobic. So it's really fun to play with that kind of stuff, because it's really just full creative once everything's been, you know, neatened up from another team.
Is that a common role on games nowadays, a dialogue designer, or is that usually only specific to certain titles or studios in all of your experience?
At least for me, when the reason I even chose that title when I was just jumping around looking what it should be, because they didn't know what they wanted to call it. I started to see that on some big AAA games popping up, especially games where people's voices are designed. But yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a common title. I mean, people like Garrett, Duncan, Paul, and Cesar could probably touch more on that.
I think you're cool. It's all good.
Yeah, I think that's, well, actually, Cesar's been doing a little bit of work like that recently on not something that's out yet, so not something that we could talk about, but he's doing that, and I certainly am hopeful that we'll get to do a little bit more of that as things progress and as projects, because it does feel like it's very project specific. Like there's been a couple of things that have come in over the years where that's been requested, but I feel like by and large it's mostly just editorial and mastering.
Yeah, for the most part, if it's ever requested with me, it's usually like pitching down characters or futzing characters, you know, and for the futzing, you know, I might put it through, I'll just provide maybe like 15 different examples of futz. The client will pick one futz, and then I'll apply that to the thousands of files that need to go through the radio.
Interesting. What sorts of differences, major differences, have you noticed between in preferences between studios or game teams? Like, are there usually like completely different varying preferences that you all have to cater to with each project?
Hmm.
Do you mean like just between different developers that come to us? Like, do we? Yeah, I think for the most part, like most of the differences that I've noticed have been sort of, it's just tiny differences here and there. Most of what is requested of us is typically the same, more or less. It just kind of depends on what type of game it is and you know, how hot or hopefully more dynamic they want the mastering to be. Obviously, I think we all enjoy it when it's a little bit more dynamic and not just like 400,000 lines of some guy yelling at you, you know. That can be a little grating after a while. So, but I think as far as the actual specs go, it's not too different. There's maybe only like a handful of people that ever have like a very specific workflow that they want you to follow and use with them. But there would be like training from them that would come along with that to make sure that you're using the tools that they want you to use properly. And we've had that happen before.
I would say like 80% of the time, the mastering specs are always very similar.
Yeah.
You know, if not the same through every project that I work on, with only, you know, like a few exceptions.
Projects that end up for mobile tend to be pretty hot, and sometimes that can be tough to master. You know, getting yelled lines to hit -9 LKFS is hard.
Yes.
It's hard to make things that loud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Painful.
Yeah, I turned my level down like 50% because I can't listen to it at the editorial level anymore. It's just impossible.
Yeah,
my ears hurt when you mentioned that spec.
I remember working on a project that had a pretty hot mastering spec, and that was what actually finally got me to get open back headphones, because I would at the time I was still using the biodynamic headphones, and I would go home every day and just in pain. Like I felt like I was just losing my hearing. And thank God I finally got these, because it saved me.
Outside of obviously the pandemic and what that's caused, what sorts of trends have you all noticed over the years in terms of expectations, quality, and the volume of work that's expected from clients?
I've certainly, like I was saying before, it really feels like more often than not, people just want things faster. They want more of it, and they want absolutely no dip in quality under any circumstance. That's an ongoing trend, which feels like it's kind of happening everywhere, really.
If I compare the work I was doing on AAA games a decade ago to the work I'm doing now, it seems like the quality has gone up a lot, but the line per hours, you know, expectation has remained the same. I think that's due to better tech, faster computers, better plugins. You know, when we started, I could only open up one audio suite plugin at once, you know, and we didn't even have clip gain. So, you know, it was just trying to have that gain tool up there, just snapping -2 dB on little sections of lines.
Oh man, wow. I haven't thought about that. I mean, I remember when I first started editing and I didn't even have macros or anything. I was just doing everything very slowly by hand, which is just excruciating to think about now, because I can't imagine not having that anymore.
Yeah, if somebody told me about macros like when I started, that would have totally saved maybe carpal tunnel, you know.
Yeah, for me, when I first started, I didn't have RX. So one of the earliest memories of me learning how to do dialogue editorial was in Pro Tools, was using the pencil tool to pencil out the waveform of clicks and copying and pasting from different parts of different lines and trying to comp things that way. And it was pretty miserable. So yeah, for sure what Garrett was saying, quality has gone up as technology has evolved over the years. So thankful for
Oh my gosh, you just reminded me, Cesar. I used to bring a Wacom tablet to Technicolor and Lydia and Tone and those guys, they would all look at me and be like, "What's he doing?" They'd look through the window. I'd be like drawing out clicks with a pencil, like on a wake tablet. Like we've come a long way, to what we're doing now in RX.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But 30 lines an hour then, 30 lines an hour now, it's kind of similar, as what they expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of things that you can do in RX, you can just do the same stuff a lot faster, especially if you have things set up, different ways. Like I use a lot of macros to adjust, especially spectral repair, like the different settings. And then one trick I found recently is you can make presets for kind of like your defaults, and I'll assign those to hotkeys. So once I've changed something, I can always switch it back to my like standard 128 band, like horizontal thing, like with one key. And so I'm constantly bouncing back between a few different presets back and forth. So really, the effort, of changing things has, gone way down. So it's a lot more fluid, I think, kind of getting from one point to the next.
Yeah. We have an audience question from Soup Deep. Are mastering specs mostly just loudness, or do clients ever post want EQ specifics? If it's not a FUTS thing, do they ever mandate things like that on your dialogue process?
Well, there's always an EQ roll off mandated, and that's always going to be like 60 hertz to 80 hertz, something like that. Like that's always in there. So they'll say 80 hertz roll off at either 18 dB per octave or 24 dB per octave. If they get that specific, that's fantastic, because I love that. Much sharper curve. But yeah, that's the amount of the EQ that we do. We've been sculpting out some stuff with editorial just to kind of match some stuff, which helps with the mastering. And that's mostly because of home recordings. You kind of have to put another EQ in there for home recordings to just kind of, take some stuff out.
Yeah, and I feel like if someone doesn't specify that they want that EQ roll off, it's probably still best to give it to them, because they just don't know that they want it.
Yeah.
It's actually way easier to edit too. Like if you just roll off all the files, it's easier to look at the waveforms. They're not all big and chunky.
You can see more definition.
There was one client I was working with who gave us ref files. That was the first time we were working with them, and they gave us the ref files for a couple of the characters that they had provided us, and they had requested us to EQ match, use EQ match within RX to batch process the files that we were editing. So that was a new request that came in recently, at least within the first couple months. So that was just a client specific one, but yeah, for the most part, just roll off.
Yeah,
it's kind of cool. It's like the clients are becoming more familiar with the tools we have available and what we could do for them.
It's a good and a bad thing. I had a producer send me a FUTS that they did in Audacity of themselves, but they didn't have a way to do it to 3,000 files. So I had to try to find a way to recreate the exact sounding FUTS for the whole game's dialogue. So,
wow.
It's an interesting experience.
We're going to open it up to audience questions in a minute or two, so please feel free to ask questions in the Zoom chat. In the meantime, another question for you all. When you're in a position to hire new game dialogue editors, what do you look for as sort of key traits in prospective editors for this format?
I would say the ability to take direction and follow instructions, and adaptability. I think that especially if you've got multiple projects going on at once and you're juggling those, especially across editors, like you may not be able to keep one person on a specific project for a while, depending on the volume of each of those. And so you've got to hope that someone will be able to, flip between 2 or 3 projects at a time and still be able to, especially master them properly, with the different mastering specs that there are. And also there's, those scripts that we'll get sometimes, you could have all kinds of like file naming rules that you need to follow on top of whatever is on the script. You might get specific mandates from the client about very specific ways that they want certain situations handled. And you need to be able to pass that information along and know that they're going to follow it without you having to constantly double check them. So that's big.
Yeah, attention to detail is huge. Like one simple thing would just be like alternate takes are going to be named _alt01. You know, and if you can't grasp that, this might not be the field for you. Not to sound mean, but you know what I mean? Sometimes, you know, we'll get all capitals, no underscore, just one, you know, and those files will get lost forever if they're not named correctly.
Yeah, big on the flip side of that, because you know I'm a freelancer who works for studios like Garrett's and Duncan's. My goal is always to try to, if I run into any issues that feel like they're kind of out of the norm, I'm always trying to communicate what that is and to keep diligent notes, because if there are any issues, you know, maybe the core game audio team needs to know about them, or you know, QC or wherever. You know, it's important to, you know, there's a standard kind of workflow that, you know, you have to maintain, and you're kind of pushing a lot of material through, but there's always going to be here and there places that are kind of like gray area where like, well, this, I don't know if this sounds right, or is this the right way to do this? And so just keeping track of any of those little kind of discrepancies over the course of thousands and thousands of files is really important, you know, and it makes me feel better that, like, you know, I've done my due diligence so that things, as Garrett said, you know, aren't getting lost down the road, because I wouldn't want all the work that I've put in to just not, you know, translate because somebody can't find the files anymore because there was one little, you know, error in there, you know.
It's like always leaving a bread trail, you know, in this line of work, because there's so many assets. People need to be able to know why you did something and where it lives.
Yeah, and because it's, you know, I work remotely, you know, I'm never, you know, talking to people necessarily face to face. So it's important to have those communication lines very clear and open so that everybody's on the same page. So there's nobody's doing things in two different ways, you know, because one of the things as a freelance editor that I run into is I may be working on a character for a game, but I'm not going to be the only editor working on that character. There's going to be other people jumping on, because it'll take months, if not years sometimes, for, you know, like Garrett and I have been working on Star Wars: The Old Republic, which is, you know, a big MMO since like 2015. And, you know, I have not done all the dialogue for that. I've been one of many editors. So it's important to maintain that consistency so that, you know, other editors are doing the same thing that I am, because all those lines have to be treated the same way ultimately, whether I'm the one doing it or somebody else.
Yeah, and I think also to your point about that's a really good one too, is communication. Is just like flagging things as you find them. I always feel that, you know, too much communication is better than not enough, because, and I can think of specific instances where you, Paul, in particular, have flagged things that we then went back to the client and flagged, and they're like, oh, thank you for pointing that out, because they may be so busy on their side. Like, you know, how often have we all gotten scripts that don't even have file names on them? I mean, that happens all the time, you know, and like, you know, so you want to be able to have an open dialogue with them about how they want stuff named, how they want assets dealt with, like, and also pointing things out to them that you're finding on the scripts when you get the real fun duplicate file names, you know. That's a pretty common one. And I think that having that kind of communication, especially with someone like freelancing, can give you the ability to talk to the client and have that kind of dialogue with them that then gives them trust in you, that you are paying attention to what you're working on for them, and not just trying to like get through stuff. And then that trust makes everything better.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that I look at it is like, you know, when the material is being recorded, you know, selects are being picked, and it's kind of a linear, the amount of time recorded is the amount of time spent. And when I'm editing, I know I'm spending, 2, 3, 4, 5 times the length of the entire session, editing, and no one else besides me is going to be spending that same amount of time on each line. So I have to be the one to make sure that all those issues are taken care of, because yes, there's QC later, but when you're dealing with this much material, it's important to make sure that, you know, each step, you know, that you're doing everything you can in that step so that the next step is always easier and not harder.
And providing those notes are very important. Like Paul said, you know, we just did a project together where Paul provided some great notes for us where, you know, certain lines are going to go to different places. I mean, like certain lines are going to get localized, other lines will not get localized.
Mhm.
So to be able to find English language inside what the client is named efforts, you know, is a good flag. You know, so that's ultimately going to save the client a lot of time and money, you know, just
Mhm.
that one little note in a script and send it back with our files.
We have audience question from Eric. Eric Hertzgaard. How much do the skills of someone who's cut dialogue for TV and film for 25 years translate to what you're doing? Is there a huge learning curve?
I feel like the basics of just knowing how to edit and knowing the tools that you need to edit are the same. Again, it's just getting used to some of the other specifics, like knowing that you're dealing with individual assets, knowing that, you know, making sure that the heads are tight, and you know, you have to listen to the tails to make sure that those sound correct. But like, again, knowing that you're just working with individual assets and that you have to treat those accordingly. Basically everything that we were talking about at the beginning of this. But I think the actual techniques involved are similar, and the learning curve is not that steep. It's really just getting used to such a completely different workflow.
Yeah, I've done a decade worth of editing for film and TV, dialogue specifically, and I haven't done anything differently in RX other than maybe chains, where I'll do multiple processes to a thing because I don't have the time to, you know, I'm not going through an hour of content. I'm going through days and weeks of content. So, but other than that, like taking out extraneous noises and background sounds, it's kind of the exact same process for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's workflow. It's being able to do what you're doing in film and TV and realizing that you have to cut, you know, out like, you know, multiple feature films length of material in the same amount of time that you would normally have, and finding ways of speeding that process up, you know, so that you're not thinking about what you're doing next. It becomes some of the things become a much more automated process. So it's just listening, identifying things, and just things are kind of almost happening. Like, you know, when I'm working at my full clip, you know, I'm not, my brain is almost on autopilot in some ways, because it's just, I know the workflow, what comes next, and my hands are doing what, you know, they're supposed to do.
We have a question from Ho-san. What is everyone's workflow in terms of starting from receiving the files, and what sorts of macros are everyone using to shorten and optimize their work process?
Well, I mean, most of the time, like in our case at Formosa, you know, 99.9% of what we're doing is Pro Tools sessions that all follow fairly similar layouts. And so it's really just a matter of taking that and either creating new tracks in there or importing tracks from those sessions into your own template, and then hitting the ground running, really. RX Connect.
For me, it's making sure everything looks organized, especially when I'm sending it off and I'm done with it. I want to make sure it's good and organized, so if someone else were to take over my session, they know exactly what the layout looks like and how they should approach that session, whether it's, you know, a couple days from the time I finish or a couple years if they're doing a sequel to a game. I want to make sure that they know, you know, how the assets were handled. And I also want to make sure that I'm using plugins that will probably be used in the future. For example, I hate to throw them under the bus, but I've opened up sessions with Ozone 8 that I can't open anymore because of Mac OS compatibility. And that's, you know, that's one of the reasons that I stopped having to use that plugin, was because of that. So those are the types of things that you have to keep in mind, you know, when working on these types of things.
We have a great question from actually combined from Noah as well as Meg. Are you ever responsible for any sort of implementation of your dialogue, bring it into the game, and do you ever work with middleware?
I wish we were able to do it more, honestly. There's only some projects that we work on, at least on the VO side and the assets and editorial side at Formosa right now, where we do, by and large, we're editing, mastering, and sending off folders full of WAV files to people to then do that. But there's been a couple here and there where we have.
How about the rest of you all? Anyone else do implementation as well of your edited dialogue?
The closest thing I ever did to that was have to record in a proprietary system brought by the developer. So it basically recorded, named, packaged, and put the lines into their system. It worked in a way that so we could record by playing off previous recordings. So it was never one side of a conversation. They could talk with the previous recordings, and it wasn't so much implementation, but that was probably the closest I got to implementation, was just putting it in their system at the recording stage.
Miguel, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna say with the design stuff that I was doing, I didn't do any implementation, but I had to go in and sit in with the game team and actually hear like, hey, how much bass is too much bass in this voice when the music's in and all this crazy sound effect stuff's going on. There was a ton of assets that sounded amazing on my system, and then I got into the game and I was like, oh man, we got to go back, and we ended up adjusting a lot going back and forth. So had I not had that communication back and forth and the access to see it implemented in the game, I think we would have had a far less quality product.
I've never done dialogue implementation, but quite a while ago, I did a few independent, like smaller games where I had to do effects, implementation, and I felt like that experience helped me realize, what game engines can do and how things can be different. So I think it definitely influenced how I approach dialogue because for games, because I think you don't know exactly when you're editing what the engine is going to be doing with it, so you have to make sure that things feel as neutral as and as clean as possible, because things could sound very, very different once it's been implemented. So
I also just want to add, like, if you're looking for a job as doing this, you're going to want to be a dialogue editor and be able to implement if you want to work at a developer. But if you want to just freelance and dialogue edit, then you won't have to implement. But there is usually that requirement, like you need to know WISE or Fmod or something if you already know game dialogue editing and you want to work directly at a developer.
No, that's helpful, Garrett. Thank you. We have a question from John G. I think, by the way, that's a character's name from the movie Memento. But do you ever use transcription software like Descript, for example?
No. Me.
Okay, from Joshua, we have a question. Does anyone have any favorite Excel functions that you use, I guess, with your scripts or lines of dialogue?
Excel scripts. I mean, I have one that's specific to certain games that have like the script has a certain format, so I'll use that to quickly like filter and format. Like auto filter and sorts tend to be pretty important when you're organizing material. If it hasn't already been organized, a lot of times I'll already get a script that's been properly organized, but if not, understanding how to filter and sort things properly so that you can match what's in the session, the script has that same order is pretty important. Because otherwise, if you can't find an automated way of, going back and forth between Excel and, the Excel script and Pro Tools, it can be very time consuming, and, Keyboard Maestro is really important to speed up that process.
Yeah, it's not so much things I might do within Excel. My Excel abilities are pretty limited. I know how to filter things and find what I'm looking for, but I use Keyboard Maestro a lot to basically copy a file, paste it into Pro Tools, name that file, also bold the file or color that cell in Excel to know that that line's already been named, go down to the next one. And so it's all these programs working together that makes the the beauty.
Ditto.
Yeah, like for example, for alts, when you have an alternate file, I'll have a menu that chooses what the naming scheme is, like _A, _alt01, _alt1, the different modes of that. And then I use like Shift1, Shift2, Shift3 to make those alts, and it'll go Keyboard Maestro will go through the file name and put in the alt underscore and everything properly the way I want it to, based on the project. And sometimes if the file name is formatted a little different, I have to adjust that macro, for that project. So I'll have different tool sets based on the project. I'll, for certain projects, I'll have to be constantly updating my macros, making copies of them, disabling the original one, and then remembering to switch it back when you're done. So
yeah, my Keyboard Maestro is full of different folders. Every folder is named a different project. Every project has different, key commands.
I will say that even though I don't, have to do any programming for game audio or game dialogue editing, my high school knowledge of computer science has been helpful in that respect for Keyboard Maestro, because it is essentially basic programming and understanding computer logic and basic workflow, like in terms of programming, is actually really important for that kind of thing in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish, because things start to get pretty complicated, and understanding how to troubleshoot and troubleshoot a macro if it's not working the way you want it to, that can be time consuming, and figuring that stuff out can take quite a bit of time, but it can save you time in the long run.
Yeah, I feel like
there's a lot of stuff I wanted to do earlier before Keyboard Maestro was really dialed in. So I ended up paying a guy to write a whole bunch of Apple scripts for me, and then I programmed that into my Stream Deck. And that's what I was running until I was, comfortable with Keyboard Maestro.
I feel like with making macros too, one of the biggest things that you end up learning is putting in those pauses. You just got to make sure to because you'll get stuff that won't work sometimes, and there's like, what is going on? Just got to find a place to put that second pause in there somewhere.
So when Pro Tools went to dark mode, then the layout changed. I had to update all my found image things.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, everything looked differently.
Wow.
Things you don't think about, when you're editing. You don't think you're gonna have to be doing programming.
Yeah.
It goes to dark mode, costs you half a day.
Exactly.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, Dan just said it, 0.2 seconds. You gotta get that pause in there.
We had a sort of combined question from two people, from Matthew and from Ho. What would be your advice for someone trying to step into this portion of the industry? Any practice that we can implement within our workflow to have a better chance at applying for projects or positions if they don't have quite the experience yet?
I mean, not workflow implementation stuff, but a huge part of any industry is who and being connected. And that's one thing I think the games industry does really well. There's a ton of really cool events all throughout the year now that things are starting to open up again, and big game conferences and tons of places to go and hang out with and meet the kind of people you want to work for. So definitely being someone that people can see, not sitting out in your house hoping to get a job.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not being afraid to reach out as well. I feel like the game audio community is fairly like accepting, and it's also very easy to communicate with people even if you go in blindly. So I think if there's something that you want to do, like reaching out to people and just establishing that line of communication and being reasonably persistent about it, because there's a level of persistence at a certain point. It's like, all right, well, I'm fairly busy. Like there's only so much that I can do, but reasonable persistence can certainly help you get somewhere, because you have to be persistent, because everyone's just so busy that it's impossible to remember everyone that's interested in doing it.
I think if you have a basic understanding of Pro Tools and Excel, you could probably find a job working on some smaller games to start, maybe mobile games, stuff like that. Build up the credits, and the credits always help to get more work. And then soon you'll be on to AAA games.
If you're starting off with RX and you haven't used it, for me, one of the biggest things is learning what each of the modules do at their max potential. So learn how to listen to those artifacts that each of those modules do, whether it's denoise, declicking. That way, once you're going through a file, you know what those artifacts sound like, and you know that you've gone too far for those types of things. So that's one of the things, like, especially as RX keeps adding more and more modules, you just push the boundaries of those things, and you learn to listen for those artifacts, and just mess with it, and also learn how to read a spectrogram, and know, as for someone who also looks at actor boosts and files, as soon as I put it in RX, I can see automatically without listening, this actor has a problem with the reverb in the room, or they have a specific note in the room that's going to have issues just by looking at the spectrogram. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. Final question for each of you. I'd love to hear from each of you on this one. If there was one thing that you wish someone would have told you before you started working as a game dialogue editor that could have helped you early in your career, what would it be?
Be patient. Be patient. Use macros, and also like take breaks. Take breaks. Get up. Get out of your chair. Take your headphones off. Go for a walk. Sometimes I know that, like, especially when I first started, I was like, I would just sit there and just work and work and work, and I would like go home. And I think we've all experienced that many times. Going home and just being like, and I think that knowing when to step away and kind of like clear your head is really important.
Yeah, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds at the beginning. And if I had a little bit more help of somebody directing me, as to how I was getting lost or why I was getting lost, I didn't quite know. Luckily, I just worked for some great companies that kept me while I was figuring this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say asking a lot of questions at the beginning, to the point of being slightly annoying. I think making sure that you're doing what the client wants you to be doing, in the way that the other editors are working, so you're working kind of as part of a team, I think is important, especially now that we're more remote. I think it's more important to communicate and make sure that everyone is comfortable, with how things should be going, and if there are any problems, to let people know so that they can be resolved.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on what Paul was talking about is, I think I just assumed I was doing everything right when I first started. Yeah, these thousands of files, the heads are tight enough, or the names are correct, and you kind of spot check instead of being real thorough about checking naming. So definitely more questions and back and forth. When I started, and actually all the game work I've done, I've been alone in my own place. I've never been part of the game team or a greater team of dialogue people. So, without asking those questions and checking in and getting that feedback, you could do weeks of work and it could be all wrong.
Yeah, that is
good point.
That has absolutely happened. And it's very frustrating, and that, yeah, communication is key, and questions are key, no doubt about it.
Cesar, how about you? Anything you wish, if there were one thing someone could have told you at the beginning of your career that could have helped? Anything that comes to mind?
I mean, when I first started, I didn't really know how to use LinkedIn or anything like that, and it was just a different time. So I think right now is like just having this panel, for example, people who are chiming in with questions in chat. I know we haven't gotten to some of them, but I see people responding to them, and I know there's a lot of good people in this chat right now who are answering some of those questions, and I trust them. And yeah, the audio community has just been amazing so far. And if you were to ask anybody on this panel, outside of this, I think we'd be willing to answer more questions. So at least I would. So I won't speak for everybody else, but yeah.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, Duncan, Garrett, Paul, Cesar, Miguel, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It was really informative listening to you all, and you've all done so much great work over the course of your careers. Really appreciate you sharing your time with all of us tonight. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. It was it's nice to see all of you. Garrett, it's great to see you after so long. And
yeah, it's great to see you,
yeah,
all you guys and do this panel.
Definitely.
I mean, it just
Yeah.
goes to show how small this industry is as well.
Mhm.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
like we've all worked together at many different companies, and now we're on a panel together years later.
Yeah, I see names popping up in the chat that I have definitely seen many times, and it's great to see that. It is a really great community, and it's nice to do this work. And thanks for
And there
setting this
are
up.
some really good questions in this chat. It would be good to answer all of them if we had more time.
Yeah, totally. And truly, to Cesar's point, I mean, I always love hearing from new people that are interested in doing this work, whether they're interested in actually, working with Formosa or just wanting to talk about it. So by all means, email us, email me. I won't speak for all of you, but email me by all means.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We have more MPSC Sound Advice events coming up, and you can watch previous events on our YouTube channel and MPSC Facebook page. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again to everyone who's been our featured guest tonight, and I hope to see you at the next MPSC Sound Advice event.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.